Do you think that there was a real world historical culture who approached the gods and the myths that they created in the same way that the cultures and peoples of Glorantha approached the gods?
Well, there's certainly uh, influences by real world mythology and real world cult on some of the Gloranthan deities. For example, the story of Orlanth and Aroka is definitely tied with the story with Indra and Tavita. I think it's Tavita, the water devouring dragon. And then there's another variant to that amongst the Hittites and another variant in Syria, if I recall. But we could also say the idea of the storm god having a fight with the dragon that devoured the waters seems to also be a fairly common archetype throughout at least Indo-European speaking people. So, you know, I could say that there's some direct analogs on that myth, or maybe what it is that that's just hitting at a root archetype that that just happened to be the one that influenced us the most when we're writing a story that also deals with that root archetype. And so it's always this chicken and the egg question for me. Is we'll often have a myth or a story or a concept, and Greg and I would look at, well, how did how did this archetype get expressed by other cultures? And with Greg, often Native American and Mesoamerican mythology would also really tie into that. So I can certainly point out some counterparts that many of the Gloranthan gods have, and some areas where we were influenced by real world mythology. But whether there's an exact counterpart, that's outside of maybe some of the iconography that we've developed for the gods, that's a hard one to say.
I'm not going to let you off that easy, Jeff. I really want to dive into this. I'm really interested to hear about how the real world way that we approach myth and folklore and everything that you've been talking about is reflected inside the Rantha. If there's not direct analogies, can you talk about some of the ones that are maybe a little closer, or inspirations, things like that?
I think the better way to approach that is that, to me, the pervasiveness of the Gloranthan gods reflect how cultures before our own viewed the world filled with spirits and gods. The world, up until we decided to kill off most of the gods in favor of our one god, and then we killed off that god sometime between the 19th and 20th century. Most human beings viewed the world as being populated by countless spirits, and somewhere between depending on the culture, between a dozen and a couple hundred gods. And that was the human condition. And Glorantha is an attempt to get ourselves back into the mindset and put ourselves back into looking at the world in a way that's analogous to how human beings looked at the world for most of our history.
So would it be fair to say that although there might not be a direct analogy for particular myths, there is maybe a more direct analogy for the way that we approached myths?
When I was writing the cults book, I was consulting an awful lot of tomes on mythology and on folklore at the same time. Obviously some Campbell, an awful lot of Jung, Dumatsil, which I'm butchering his name, of course, always do, and it also just guides on Mesopotamian and Mesoamerican mythology, etc. And so, basically this giant chili of different myths, different gods, and then drew on that for the various cults. Now, some of them I can certainly see, like with Orlanth, there's a lot of Indra. There's also a lot of Shiva in Orlanth. In Ernalda, we've got a half dozen mother goddess cults, and there's I think it's Burkhardt who wrote a book about 50, 60 years ago on Greek religion, which actually was really influential for me on trying to understand Ernalda. But you get, you can see in many of these cults, like in Humacht, one of the things that we really drew on with Humacht is a number of ascetic sects around the world, because Humacht isn't just about, killing folk and being a kick-ass swordsman. It's about rejecting the world of the living, the world of the flesh. There's an asceticism to Humacht, which of course gets influenced by real world ascetic sects, because we can only draw on that which we have experiences with.
Are there any mythological archetypes which were common in our world, which aren't necessarily reflected in the world of Glorantha?
Well, it's Glorantha doesn't have a whole lot of self-resurrecting gods. So we don't have, we have all of the gods come back with the dawn and the compromise, but we don't have, Inanna and Damazi. Damazi was the consort of Inanna when Inanna went down into the underworld to confront her sister and suddenly realized she was trapped, and when she made a bargain that she could be released if she would put another god in her place. Damazi, she was her lover and consort, and she found him partying and not properly mourning Inanna. So she sent Damazi down to hell, but then they worked out a way where Damazi would also come back. That's Persephone myth, the Damazi myth, Jesus Christ, etc. Dionysus. Glorantha does that collectively among all of the gods. So Yelm was sent to the underworld, and now he's back. But we have that same story about an awful lot of gods. And so I there's an element where that's a really powerful real world myth that I don't think we make heavy use of in Glorantha. We make some use of it, but we swapped it out for what in my opinion was actually one of Greg's most amazing literary creations, which really doesn't have a real world corollary, and that's the Lightbringer's Quest.
A flip side to my last question, what is overrepresented? I mean, Glorantha is very tied to RuneQuest, which is fundamentally a game. So does that mean that there are aspects of Glorantha that are put too far to the forefront because they're linked to what needs to fit into a game?
Gods dealing with fighting and kicking butt and providing, it's funny. Recently on one of the social media pages, we have a very active RuneQuest Facebook page, and there was some discussions that a number of gods don't have enough fighting magic. And it's like, well, here I am. I'm thinking, God, we have too much of it. Let's rein it back. That actually doesn't, giving everybody and their dog true weapon doesn't feel right to me. But that is a byproduct of tabletop role-playing games. This is our archetype, or assumption is well, the characters are going to go in and they're going to fight stuff, which is the case, and there's nothing wrong if that's what your game is about. But as a result, I think that those sorts of deities are overrepresented in Glorantha. and the fertility goddesses, the goddesses of sex and love and childbirth and all of that. We've given Arnalda has come roaring back in the last 10-15 years. And I think she's now one of the more popular player character cults. But if it was up to me, I'd love to go, more on introducing cults of fertility, because that's as important a thing for human beings as fighty gods. But maybe they're not as cool characters.
Well, people respond to Glorantha. That's plain to see. A lot of people really connect to the myths and stories that are told within it. What makes it special? Why do these myths resonate? Why are they so important?
So among the things that, and one of the reasons that to me Glorantha really lives and breathes and feels like a real mythology, is that we hit these big archetypes of sex, of death, of war, of the underworld, as well as things like skies and storms and earth and whatever, because mythology and real world mythology often puts these really big human issues right front and center of their religious experience. So you look at go into one of my the other talks that I've been fascinated with, is you look at Inanna and Dumazi. Inanna she's a war goddess. She's also a goddess of sex and of love. Aphrodite, who some scholars think it was either derived from Inanna or influenced by the Inanna cult, etc. We know her primarily as a goddess of love and beauty, but the Romans also held her to be a war and conquest goddess. There's a reason that Julius Caesar emphasized that Venus was his ancestor.
Are there parts of our real world mythology, our real world heritage, that are just fundamentally unable to be reflected inside Glorantha, either because they don't fit inside a game setting, or we just can't attach ourselves to that way of thinking again?
One of the things about Glorantha's mythologies is it's experimental mythology that's got an ancient world feel, but its audience is us. Its audience is 21st century gamers, and has as many ties to the counterculture of California in the 60s and 70s as it has to the historical Bronze Age. And as a result, the gods, by and large, the deities in Glorantha are not as in your face brutal as many real world cultures, because that's not fun. We don't have gods that, we don't have very many deities in Glorantha that demand human sacrifice. And in general, most Gloranthan cults treat human sacrifice as something that is a little bit beyond the pale. It's not chaotic, but it's, Orlanth, Arnalda, Yelm, and many of the great deities do not want to be offered human sacrifice in any circumstance. In the real world, that may have been more common. We don't have a lot of cults where when the rich dude dies, every member of his household and all of his slaves and servants get sacrificed with them and buried so they can continue to serve him in the afterlife. I don't think we were really hip on that. You've got a couple of vile cults like Zarak Zaran that do things like that. They bind some of the members of their cult to become skeletons or zombies to serve the cult after death. But that's a bad guy cult. Nobody sits around and goes, gosh, I wish I could live my life more like those Zarak Zaran cultists. And these are things that in our own real world mythology, well, the world was a much less fun place and a much more brutal place. And as a result, there were a lot of powers that we needed to understand and give symbolic meaning for, that really aren't fun for us in the 21st century to really dwell on a whole lot. Or we've even pushed them and said, you know, these aren't just unpleasant sides to otherwise benevolent deities. We're going to make them chaos deities. We're, you know, disease. Disease is in Glorantha is associated with Malia, who's tainted by chaos. In the real world, Apollo was also a disease giver. He was a healing god and somebody who struck those who pissed him off with plagues and diseases. You know, and we don't do, you know, Glorantha doesn't have quite as many deities that are as both benevolent and malevolent at the same time. Deities tend to be either fairly benevolent or maybe benevolent, but with an awful big destructive side. You know, think Orlanth or a lot of the storm gods. But there's very few. You know, maybe Humocht would be one of the few that, you know, he's just as likely to help you as to kill you as help you. But then that's because he's the god of death, and sooner or later Humocht's going to come for all of us. But in the real world mythology, we had a lot more ambivalence, and that's something we really toned down in Glorantha.